You didn't yell, you didn't argue, you didn't explain, you just left. And that was the moment everything collapsed for them. Because here's the truth no one tells you. It wasn't your strength that broke them, it was your absence. If this resonates with you, if you left quietly and watched the chaos unfold, pause for a moment. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks staying and fighting is the only way to be strong. Narcissists are psychologically structured to expect resistance. From early on, they learn to regulate their fragile self-esteem through dominance, reaction, and emotional engagement. When someone pushes back, argues, cries, defends themselves, or even pleads, it confirms something crucial for them: influence. Resistance tells them they still matter, that they still have the power to provoke emotion, shape behavior, and stay central in another person's inner world. Even negative attention reassures them of relevance. This is why they often escalate conflict when challenged. The fight itself becomes proof of control, a twisted form of connection that stabilizes their internal chaos. What they do not expect is disengagement. Leaving removes the psychological script they rely on. There is no argument to win, no behavior to correct, no emotional reaction to manipulate. This creates a profound sense of disorientation. Without resistance, they lose the feedback loop that tells them who they are in relation to you. The absence of reaction feels like erasure, not maturity. It destabilizes their identity because their sense of self depends on impact, not intimacy. In narcissistic psychology, power is not about love or closeness, it is about effect. Resistance provides effect, leaving provides none. That is why disengagement feels far more threatening than confrontation. When you fight back, you remain psychologically present. When you leave, you become inaccessible. Inaccessibility is intolerable to someone who equates control with safety. It forces them into an internal vacuum where they must sit with feelings they habitually outsource to others, such as shame, inadequacy, and fear of insignificance. This is also why they often reframe your departure as cruelty, abandonment, or betrayal. That narrative allows them to regain a sense of moral superiority and avoid confronting the deeper wound, which is the loss of influence. They are not grieving the relationship, they are reacting to the collapse of a dynamic that kept them regulated. Leaving interrupts the system that allowed them to feel powerful without self-reflection. And that interruption is experienced as a threat rather than a loss. Fighting back often feels like strength, but within narcissistic psychology, it functions very differently. When you argue, defend yourself, explain your intentions, or try to prove your reality, you are still participating in their emotional economy. Every response becomes usable. Your words can be twisted, your emotions can be mined, and your reactions can be studied for leverage. Even when you are standing up for yourself, you are signaling availability. You are showing that they still have access to your attention and your inner world, and attention is the primary resource they seek. Conflict gives them structure. It creates roles where they can position themselves as superior, misunderstood, victimized, or provoked. The specifics of the argument rarely matter. What matters is that the interaction keeps going. As long as you are engaging, they remain psychologically anchored. Your frustration reassures them that they still have the power to disturb your emotional balance. In that sense, fighting back unintentionally rewards the very behavior you are trying to stop. This is why many people notice that setting verbal boundaries or calling out behavior leads to escalation rather than resolution. The narcissistic system interprets confrontation not as a limit but as stimulation. It confirms that the connection is still alive and that they are still significant enough to provoke a response. Even calm, logical explanations can be absorbed as fuel because they keep the relational loop intact. Leaving disrupts this completely. It removes the feedback they rely on to regulate themselves. There is no tone to analyze, no emotion to provoke, no opening to reassert dominance. The silence is not neutral to them, it is destabilizing. Without engagement, they are forced to face a sense of powerlessness they spend their lives avoiding. This is why disengagement often triggers frantic attempts to reinitiate contact, sudden apologies, or dramatic accusations. These are not about repair, they are attempts to restart the emotional exchange. Fighting back keeps the dynamic alive even when it feels justified. Leaving ends the dynamic altogether. One maintains the system, the other collapses it. That is why disengagement, not confrontation, is what ultimately removes their control. Emotional supply is the psychological lifeline a narcissist depends on to maintain a sense of self. It comes from attention, admiration, fear, compliance, conflict, and even pain. Any strong emotional reaction reassures them that they exist as someone powerful and impactful in another person's world. When you are present and emotionally responsive, they can regulate their inner instability through you. Your feelings become a mirror that reflects significance back to them, even when those feelings are negative. When you leave, that supply is abruptly cut off. This is not experienced as a normal breakup or separation. It feels like psychological starvation. The familiar source of validation and regulation is suddenly unavailable, and there is no internal structure to replace it. Unlike people who can self-soothe or process loss internally, narcissistic individuals rely heavily on external input to manage their emotional state. Your absence removes the stabilizer they unconsciously depended on. This is why leaving can provoke reactions that seem disproportionate or confusing. Rage, sudden vulnerability, idealization, or devaluation often appear after the supply is gone. These are not signs of genuine emotion emerging. They are survival responses to deprivation. The nervous system is scrambling to restore equilibrium by any means possible. Reaching out, provoking jealousy, rewriting the narrative, or seeking attention elsewhere are all attempts to refill the empty space left behind. The most destabilizing part is not missing you as a person, but losing the role you played in their internal economy. You were a regulator, not a partner. Once that function disappears, the illusion of control weakens. They may cycle between blaming you and idealizing you because both responses keep you psychologically present. Being ignored entirely is far more distressing because it offers no emotional feedback. Removing emotional supply forces a confrontation with emptiness they work hard to avoid. Without someone to react, reflect, or absorb their emotional turbulence, they are left alone with unresolved shame, insecurity, and fragility. Leaving does not punish them, it simply withdraws participation. That withdrawal exposes how dependent their sense of stability was on someone else's emotional availability. And once that dependency is revealed, the dynamic can no longer function in the same way. Silence has a unique psychological impact on narcissistic personalities because it removes stimulation without offering explanation. Confrontation, even when painful, still provides engagement. Words create a back and forth, a structure they can manipulate, reinterpret, or dominate. Silence offers none of that. It does not argue, justify, or defend. Instead, it creates a void where their usual strategies fail to land. That void is experienced as deeply unsettling rather than peaceful. When you stop responding, the narcissistic mind does not interpret silence as maturity or self-protection. It is perceived as rejection and erasure. Silence communicates that they no longer hold enough power to elicit a reaction. This is more injurious than anger because anger still proves importance. Silence suggests irrelevance. For someone whose self-worth depends on impact, being ignored feels like a threat to psychological survival. Silence also disrupts their ability to control the narrative in real time. When you argue, they can redirect, gaslight, or provoke further. When you are silent, there is nothing to counter, twist, or exploit. This loss of influence often leads to escalation, sudden outreach, or attempts to provoke a response through guilt, fear, or nostalgia. These behaviors are driven by the need to restore contact, not to repair connection. Another reason silence cuts so deeply is that it forces internal reflection without relief. In the absence of your reactions, unresolved feelings have nowhere to go. Shame, insecurity, and fear rise to the surface without an external container. Silence removes the distraction that emotional exchanges provide. It exposes internal emptiness that is normally masked by interaction and control. Unlike confrontation, which can be reframed as mutual conflict, silence leaves them alone with unanswered questions. Why are you not reacting? Why are you unreachable? Why does nothing they do seem to matter? These questions destabilize the grandiose self-image and create psychological discomfort that cannot be easily resolved. Silence is not passive. It is an active withdrawal of participation. It denies access without explanation and removes the emotional mirror they rely on to define themselves. This is why silence often provokes stronger reactions than any argument ever could, because it does not feed the system, it starves it. And in that starvation, the illusion of control begins to collapse. Dominance is central to how a narcissist experiences safety and identity. It is not simply about being admired or liked, but about occupying a superior position in the emotional hierarchy of a relationship. As long as they can influence your thoughts, reactions, or decisions, their internal sense of power remains intact. This dominance reassures them that they are significant, protected from feelings of inadequacy, and above the vulnerability they fear. The relationship becomes a structure that props up their self-image. When you leave, that structure collapses abruptly. Your departure is not interpreted as a choice you made for yourself, but as a direct challenge to their assumed authority. Leaving communicates that their control was neither permanent nor absolute. It exposes a reality they work hard to deny, that another person can disengage without permission. This realization strikes at the core of their psychological framework. What makes this particularly destabilizing is that dominance relies on consent, even if it is unconscious. As long as you stay, argue, explain, or try to be understood, you are still participating in the hierarchy they have created. Leaving revokes that participation entirely. There is no longer a role for them to occupy in your life, no leverage to apply, no position from which to exert influence. The power imbalance they depended on disappears the moment you stop playing along. This loss often triggers frantic efforts to reassert dominance. They may attempt to intimidate, charm, guilt, or discredit you. These behaviors are not random. They are attempts to restore the familiar dynamic where they feel superior and in control. Even portraying themselves as the victim can be a strategy to regain psychological upper ground and rewrite the meaning of your exit. Your leaving also confronts them with a painful contradiction. They often believe they are indispensable, irreplaceable, and central to others' lives. Your ability to walk away disproves that belief. It shows that their dominance was situational, not inherent. That realization can fracture the grandiose self-image and provoke deep insecurity. Leaving does not attack them directly, but it dismantles the illusion that sustained their sense of dominance. Without someone beneath them to control or define themselves against, the structure they relied on collapses, and with it the false certainty that they were always in charge. When a narcissist is left, the psychological injury is rarely processed as loss in a healthy, reflective way. Instead, the departure threatens their fragile self-image, and the mind moves quickly to protect it. One of the most common defenses is reframing the other person's exit as betrayal. This reframing allows them to avoid the more destabilizing truth that they were left because of their own behavior or because the dynamic was no longer tolerable. Accepting that reality would require accountability and self-examination, which feel intolerable to them. By casting your departure as betrayal, they reposition themselves as the wronged party. This restores a sense of moral superiority and preserves the belief that they are fundamentally good, deserving, and mistreated. The narrative becomes about what you did to them rather than what they did to you. In their internal story, your leaving is no longer a consequence but an attack. This shift reduces shame and replaces it with anger or righteous indignation, emotions that feel far safer and more empowering. This reframing also serves a social function. When they describe the situation to others, portraying you as disloyal or cruel helps them maintain external validation. It recruits sympathy and reinforces the image they want to project. The goal is not accuracy, but stabilization of the self. Being seen as abandoned or betrayed keeps their identity intact and deflects scrutiny away from their patterns. Internally, this narrative blocks grief. Grieving would require acknowledging vulnerability and emotional dependence, which clashes with the grandiose self-concept. Betrayal, on the other hand, allows them to stay emotionally activated without feeling weak. It keeps the connection alive in a distorted form because anger and resentment still tether them psychologically to you. Reframing your departure also protects them from confronting the deeper wound, which is the loss of control and relevance. If you left because you chose yourself, it implies autonomy they could not dominate. Labeling it betrayal turns that autonomy into a moral failure, preserving the illusion that they were entitled to your presence. This mental maneuver is not conscious manipulation as much as psychological survival. It allows them to maintain coherence in the face of an ego-threatening event, even though it prevents growth or insight. By refusing to see your leaving as a boundary, they avoid the discomfort of recognizing their role in the collapse of the relationship. Leaving removes the external buffer that a narcissist relies on to avoid their inner world. For much of their life, they manage uncomfortable feelings by exporting them onto others through control, conflict, admiration seeking, or emotional provocation. Relationships become containers for emotions they do not know how to process internally. As long as someone is present and responsive, they can keep their attention outward and avoid confronting what lies beneath. When you leave, that strategy fails. There is no longer someone available to absorb their tension, validate their self-image, or distract them from internal discomfort. This creates an abrupt encounter with emptiness. Emptiness here does not mean calm or neutrality, but a sense of hollowness, instability, and lack of self-definition. Without external input, their identity feels unanchored. This forced confrontation is deeply distressing because it exposes unresolved shame and insecurity that have been defended against for years. The grandiose self they present to the world exists to cover a fragile core. When the relationship ends through disengagement rather than dramatic rupture, the defenses lose effectiveness. There is no external drama to focus on, no opponent to blame in real time, and no emotional exchange to regulate their mood. The mind turns inward, and what it finds there is often unbearable. This is why they may appear restless, irritable, or frantic after you leave. They might seek constant stimulation, jump quickly into new relationships, or provoke attention in other ways. These behaviors are not about moving on. They are attempts to escape the internal silence that exposes feelings of worthlessness and fear of insignificance. Any external focus is preferable to sitting with emptiness. Facing emptiness also challenges their sense of continuity. Without someone reflecting importance back to them, they struggle to feel real or stable. The relationship served as a psychological mirror. Its absence creates a loss of coherence, not just loneliness. They are not missing closeness, they are missing structure. Your leaving does not create this emptiness, it reveals it. It removes the cover that kept deeper vulnerabilities out of awareness. That exposure is one of the most destabilizing experiences for a narcissistic psyche because it cannot be easily controlled, reframed, or projected away. Healing begins when participation ends because the dynamic itself is what causes the damage. In narcissistic relationships, harm is not limited to isolated incidents. It is embedded in the ongoing pattern of control, invalidation, and emotional extraction. As long as you remain engaged, even in the name of fixing or understanding, your nervous system stays activated. You are constantly monitoring, anticipating, explaining, and bracing. This state prevents recovery because it keeps you psychologically tethered to the source of stress. Stopping participation changes the entire internal landscape. When you leave, your body and mind finally receive a consistent signal of safety. There is no longer a need to stay hypervigilant or emotionally reactive. Over time, the nervous system begins to downregulate. Thoughts slow. Emotional clarity increases. What once felt confusing starts to make sense, not because you got answers from them, but because the noise stopped. Disengagement also restores agency. In the relationship, your choices were often shaped by their moods, reactions, or needs. Leaving returns decision-making to you. Even small choices begin to feel empowering again because they are no longer negotiated against someone else's volatility. This gradual reclaiming of autonomy is central to healing. Another critical aspect is the return of self-trust. Narcissistic dynamics erode confidence in your perceptions through gaslighting and minimization. When you stop participating, you remove the ongoing source of distortion. Without constant contradiction, your internal compass recalibrates. You begin to trust your feelings and interpretations again, which strengthens emotional resilience. Healing does not require closure from the other person. Closure emerges from consistency and distance. Each day of non-participation reinforces the reality that peace does not require their validation or understanding. This realization shifts the focus from them to you. Leaving is not an act of punishment or revenge. It is an act of self-preservation. By withdrawing from the dynamic, you stop reinforcing it. The system collapses not through confrontation, but through absence. In that absence, space opens for recovery, self-connection, and a life no longer organized around managing someone else's instability.